The shutters filter morning light into your small cottage, but it brings no warmth, only the harsh reminder that you're beginning yet another day consumed by relentless hunger. Your name is Margarita, and it's the winter of 1315. You find yourself living through what many have started calling the Great Famine, a catastrophe that has systematically transformed prosperous European communities into collections of hollow-eyed survivors fighting desperately for each breath. The village of Saint-Étienne, which once bustled with life and activity, has become a shadow of itself. For the past 4 months, you have awakened with the same sensation, an emptiness in your belly that seems to consume you from the inside. Around you, the impossible task of keeping your family alive grows more daunting each day. With nothing left to eat and resources depleted to their absolute minimum, you face a reality that would have seemed incomprehensible just a year ago. Cold seeps through every gap in your cottage walls, a relentless assault that never truly stops. The straw beneath you offers minimal cushioning against the hard-packed earth floor, and your thin woolen blanket provides almost no protection against the bitter December air that surrounds you. Next to you lies your husband Henri, and his breathing troubles you deeply. Each inhalation comes shallow and labored, speaking volumes about the toll these months have taken on his body. Once, your husband possessed tremendous strength. His frame was muscular and capable of any physical task you might imagine. Now, he's been transformed into something almost unrecognizable. His ribs protrude visibly through a threadbare shirt he hasn't removed in weeks. The concept of changing clothes belongs to a world that feels impossibly distant, a fantasy from another lifetime. In these times, the luxury of soap and hot water for washing feels like an impossible dream, something from stories rather than lived experience. The cottage itself tells the story of your family's gradual descent. The silence that greets you this morning is deafening. There's no crackling fire to welcome your awakening because you run out of wood. In the corner sits a small pile of kindling you've been carefully hoarding, treating it like treasure reserved exclusively for moments when the cold becomes so dangerous it might claim another family member's life. Over these months, you've burned virtually everything. Wooden bowls that once held food have become fuel. An extra stool has gone into the flames. Even the handle of your late father's axe, an object that held both practical and sentimental value, has been consumed by fire. The furniture that once made this place feel like a true home has been methodically transformed into brief moments of warmth. What remains now is only the absolute essentials needed for survival, nothing more. Your stomach clenches with pain you've grown accustomed to, though accustomed doesn't mean the sensation has become any less terrible. This hunger extends far beyond simple appetite or discomfort. It's a deep, aching void that seems to devour you from within, a relentless reminder that your body is gradually consuming itself to maintain even the barest spark of life. When you try to remember your last real meal, your mind travels back to early September before the endless rains came and destroyed the remaining harvest. Since those final days of autumn, you've survived on increasingly desperate substitutes for real food. Your diet has become unrecognizable compared to anything you once knew. The daily ritual of finding something, anything that might be edible, has become your primary purpose. You force yourself into a sitting position, battling against a weakness that makes even the simplest movements feel like pushing through thick mud. Your muscles have essentially given up on you, sustained now only by fierce determination to see your children live another day. Standing up requires careful planning. You must shift your weight gradually, finding balance as your body protests violently against the demands you place on it. The dizziness that comes with every change in position has become so normal that you barely register it anymore. It's simply another obstacle in the complex dance of survival. Your first priority each morning has become checking on the children. 7-year-old Marie remains curled against the cottage wall, her small body barely visible beneath a collection of rags and scraps that serve as her bedding. Her breathing comes steady but shallow, and when you place your hand gently on her forehead, you feel skin that's cool and papery to the touch. She hasn't spoken in 3 days now. She's learned that speaking requires precious energy, better saved for the basic functions of staying alive. The bright, chattering child who once filled your cottage with laughter has retreated deep inside herself. She emerges only when absolutely necessary, when survival demands some action or response. Your youngest, 4-year-old Pierre lies restlessly beside his sister. His sleep is disrupted and broken, punctuated by soft, whimpering sounds that shatter your heart each time you hear them. His belly protrudes grotesquely from his skeletal frame, a cruel mockery of malnutrition that swells even as his limbs waste away to nothing. When Pierre's eyes flutter open and he looks at you, what you see troubles you deeply. The spark of childhood curiosity that once danced in his gaze has been replaced by an ancient weariness that no 4-year-old should ever carry. The weight of knowing too much suffering for such a young age shows in every glance. The morning assessment continues as you take inventory of what remains. Your family's resources have dwindled to almost nothing. In the corner where a ladder once stood, a single turnip sits like a precious gem, more valuable than gold could ever be. This gnarled, half-rotten vegetable represents everything you have. It's the difference between eating today and going without, between having strength to move and lying motionless in the straw, between hoping for tomorrow and surrendering to despair. Over the past week, you've been carefully rationing this one vegetable. You cut away the blackened portions with meticulous attention, stretching each small piece to last as long as possible. Today, if you're careful with your portions, you might be able to create one more thin soup. At least water remains accessible, though even this basic necessity requires effort you can barely afford to expend. The well in the village square still produces clean water. That much hasn't changed. But the walk there and back demands precious energy that your body struggles to provide. It also exposes you to wind that cuts through your inadequate clothing like a knife blade. Your shoes have deteriorated to the point where they're barely recognizable as footwear. Once, they were sturdy leather boots that Henri crafted for you during prosperous times, objects he was quite proud of. Now they consist mostly of carefully placed rags held together with binding cord, more fabric wrapping than actual shoe. Each step on the frozen ground sends sharp pains through your feet. But staying inside guarantees death for your children, so you make the journey anyway. Warmth presents another impossible choice in your daily survival calculations. You could burn one of your remaining pieces of kindling to create a small fire, something that might last perhaps an hour. It would provide brief comfort and the ability to warm whatever meager food you can prepare. But once that wood is gone, it's gone forever. The days ahead stretch endlessly into a winter that shows absolutely no signs of ending. The weather patterns this year have been unlike anything even the oldest villagers can remember. Rain destroyed crops during the growing season. Early snows arrived weeks before their normal time. The combination has created conditions that seem almost designed to torture the population. Henri begins to stir, his movement slow and deliberate as consciousness gradually returns. He was once the strongest man in the village, capable of working from dawn until dusk and still having energy to play with the children in the evening. Now, the simple act of sitting up leaves him breathless and shaking. His eyes, when they finally meet yours, carry a mixture of love and desperation that has become the defining characteristic of your relationship during these terrible months. You communicate without words. Both of you understand what today will bring, the same impossible choices that have defined every day since the famine began. The children's needs take precedence over everything else, and this hierarchy requires no conscious discussion. Whatever food exists will go to them first. Then Henry needs strength to venture out searching for work or any possible source of sustenance. You will eat last if anything remains at all, accepting hunger as the price of keeping your family alive. This order of survival has become so natural that you no longer question it. You don't question the wisdom of boiling tree bark to create something resembling soup, or the necessity of eating grass when no other options exist. These practices that would have seemed unthinkable during times of plenty have become routine, normal, the expected way of life. Outside your cottage, the village itself tells the story of widespread desperation through its very silence. The normal bustle of morning activity, people preparing for work, children playing, merchants setting up their goods, has been completely replaced by an eerie quiet. The only sounds that break this silence are occasional coughing fits, or the sound of someone splitting what little wood they might have managed to find. Children no longer laugh and play. The sounds of their games have vanished completely, replaced by subdued voices of parents attempting to comfort little ones who don't understand why their stomachs hurt or why Mama and Papa look so worried all the time. Even the animals have fallen silent. Those few that haven't already been slaughtered and eaten in the early weeks of the famine remain hidden or moved away. The village priest continues his tradition of ringing the bell for morning prayers, though the congregation that gathers has dwindled significantly. Only the most devout or most desperate still make the effort. Father Guam himself has grown dramatically thinner. His once round face is now drawn and hollow, yet he persists in offering what comfort he can to his suffering parishioners. His sermons have changed character in recent weeks, focusing less on abstract theological concepts and more on practical guidance for enduring hardship with dignity and faith. He speaks often of Job's trials, drawing parallels between biblical suffering and the very real anguish that grips every household in your village. The social structures that once governed village life have begun breaking down under the pressure of survival. Neighbors who once shared tools and helped with harvests now eye each other with suspicion. People wonder what hidden stores of food might exist behind closed doors. Accusations of hoarding have led to bitter disputes between families who lived in harmony for generations. The bonds of community that held the village together during good times have proven fragile when tested by genuine desperation. Yet, even in this darkness, small acts of kindness continue to emerge occasionally. Yesterday, old Widow Inez appeared at your door with a handful of acorns she had gathered from the forest floor. The bitter nuts require extensive boiling to become even marginally edible, but they represent calories that might keep your children alive for another day. She asked for nothing in return, understanding completely that you have nothing to give. The simple gesture brought tears to your eyes for the first time in weeks. Such moments of grace remind you that humanity persists, even when everything else seems to be crumbling away. The morning routine continues with the careful rationing of water for washing. A small basin serves multiple purposes throughout the day. First, it holds drinking water when you manage to bring some from the well. Then it serves for the minimal cleaning that basic hygiene demands. Finally, you use it to soak the last scraps of turnip, attempting to extract every possible bit of nutrition. Nothing can be wasted when waste means death. Every drop of water must serve its maximum purpose before being discarded. Even the dirty water will eventually be used to dampen the earth floor, reducing the dust that aggravates the persistent coughs that have developed in the absence of proper nutrition. As you prepare to face another day of impossible choices, the weight of responsibility settles on your shoulders like a familiar burden. Today, you will need to decide whether to venture into the forest, searching for anything edible, knowing full well that others have already stripped the area bare of obvious food sources. You will determine how much of your remaining turnip to use now versus saving for tomorrow, gambling with your family's immediate hunger against the uncertainty of future meals. The choice between burning precious fuel for warmth or saving it for cooking will demand your attention. You'll have to decide between exposing yourself to dangerous cold or remaining inside while your children grow progressively weaker. The sun climbs higher in the winter sky, offering the promise of light, but no warmth to speak of. Another day of the Great Famine has begun, and you are Margaret, a medieval woman facing the ancient human struggle against starvation. You have nothing but determination, love for your family, and the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, you will find a way to survive until spring arrives to break winter's deadly grip on the land. The reality of your situation crystallizes as you begin the morning's first impossible decision. The turnip in your possession could provide a watery broth that might quiet the children's hunger pangs for a few hours. Alternatively, you could attempt to preserve half of it for tomorrow, risking their immediate suffering against the uncertainty of finding anything else to eat. Your hands shake slightly as you pick up the vegetable, feeling its weight and examining the soft spots that indicate advancing decay. Time is not on your side. Every hour of delay means more of this precious food will become inedible. Marie's eyes flutter open as you move about the cottage, and she watches you with silent intensity that has replaced her former chattiness. She understands with the terrible wisdom that hunger teaches, that speaking requires energy better saved for survival. When she does speak, her voice comes out barely louder than a whisper. She doesn't ask for food or warmth, but simply wonders when Papa will be strong enough to tell stories again. The question pierces your heart more sharply than any physical pain the famine has inflicted. Henri attempts to rise from the straw bedding, his movements careful and calculated to avoid the dizzy spells that have become increasingly frequent. His role as provider and protector weighs heavily on him, perhaps even more than the physical hunger. Medieval men derived their identity from their ability to care for their families, and the famine has stripped him of this fundamental purpose. He speaks in short, measured sentences now, conserving breath while trying to maintain the appearance of strength for the children's sake. The cottage itself tells your family's story of gradual descent into desperation. Hooks on the walls that once held tools now stand empty. The implements were traded away for handfuls of grain in the early weeks of the crisis. The wooden chest that contained your family's few valuables sits open and hollow. Its contents were exchanged for food that provided perhaps 3 days of meager sustenance. Even your wedding ring, a simple band of pewter that Henry had saved months to afford, disappeared weeks ago. You traded it to a traveling merchant who offered a small sack of barley in exchange. The process of preparing the morning's meal requires careful ceremony and precise measurement. You slice the turnip with a knife so dull it barely qualifies as a blade, having been used for everything from cutting food to scraping bark from trees to digging in the frozen ground. Each piece must be exactly the same size to ensure fair distribution, though the portions have grown smaller each day as your supplies dwindle. The children watch this ritual with focused attention of scholars, knowing that these few morsels represent the difference between having strength to move and lying motionless in the straw. Water for cooking comes from the pot that sits beside your door. This vessel once seemed comically large for your family's needs, but now appears almost mockingly spacious for the thin broths it contains. The ice film that forms on the surface each night must be broken carefully to avoid wasting any of the precious liquid underneath. Even this basic task requires planning and energy conservation, as the repetitive motion of breaking ice can leave your weakened arms aching for hours afterward. The fire you eventually decide to build consists of just 3 small pieces of wood, each one representing a calculated gamble with your family's future warmth. The smoke that rises from these meager flames carries with it not just the scent of burning wood, but the essence of furniture that once made your house a home. Today's fire consumes what was once the leg of your grandmother's stool, a piece of family history transformed into a brief moment of warmth and the ability to cook your ration food. As the turnip pieces simmer in water barely sufficient to cover them, you add ingredients that would have been unthinkable during times of plenty. Tree bark, carefully stripped and boiled to remove the most bitter compounds, provides bulk, if not actual nutrition. Grass gathered from beneath the snow adds color and the illusion of substance to the broth. A few precious grains of salt hoarded from better times help mask the unpalatable flavors of desperation that characterize your current diet. Pierre awakens with the soft whimpering that has replaced his former cheerful morning chatter. His small body curls instinctively toward the weak warmth of the fire, and his eyes seek out your face with the desperate trust that children reserve for their parents, even in the darkest circumstances. When he asks for milk, a request that has become routine despite its impossibility, your heart breaks anew. The village's cows succumbed to starvation months ago. Even the memory of fresh milk seems like a fantasy from another lifetime. The morning's activities must be carefully choreographed to maximize efficiency while minimizing energy expenditure. Every movement serves multiple purposes, Every action is calculated to preserve strength while accomplishing necessary tasks. Stirring the pot provides warmth for your hands while ensuring the meager soup doesn't burn. Adjusting the children's bedding serves to check on their condition while conserving the heat their bodies generate. Even conversation becomes strategic, with words chosen carefully to provide comfort without requiring extensive vocal effort. Outside your cottage, the village begins its own morning ritual of survival. Smoke rises from only a handful of chimneys, indicating which families still possess fuel for fires. The absence of smoke from many homes tells its own grim story, marking households where the choice between warmth and preserving wood for cooking has been decided in favor of the latter. The sound of axes that once rang out regularly as villagers prepared their daily fuel has been replaced by the soft scraping of people searching for any combustible material that might have been overlooked. The church bell rings again, its bronze voice carrying across the frozen village with a clarity that seems almost supernatural in the thin winter air. Father Guam's calls to prayer have taken on new meaning during the famine, serving less as reminders of scheduled worship and more as signals that another day has begun and that the village still possesses enough life to mark its passage. The bell itself has become a symbol of continuity, proof that some traditions endure even when everything else crumbles. Your own spiritual life has undergone profound changes during these months of suffering. Prayers once focused on gratitude and requests for prosperity have transformed into desperate bargaining with divine forces that seem increasingly distant. You find yourself promising impossible devotions in exchange for just one more day of life for your children, offering sacrifices you don't possess in hopes of miraculous intervention that logic tells you will not come. The soup reaches a temperature that passes for hot, though the weak fire provides barely enough heat to warm the liquid through. This moment represents the culmination of the morning's efforts, the transformation of your last food into something that might sustain life for a few more hours. The aroma that rises from the pot bears little resemblance to the hearty stews that once filled your cottage with inviting scents, but it represents hope in its most basic form. Serving the meal requires its own careful protocol, developed through weeks of practice and refined by necessity. Marie receives the first portion, not because she is the eldest, but because her smaller body seems most vulnerable to the cold. Pierre follows, with his serving carefully measured to account for his age and size. Henry's portion comes next, larger than the children's because his frame requires more fuel, but still pathetically small by any reasonable standard. Your own serving, when it finally comes, consists of whatever remains in the pot after the others have been fed. Some days, this means a few spoonfuls of thin broth. Other days, merely the water in which the vegetables were cooked. Today, fortune grants you several small pieces of turnip and enough liquid to feel the warmth spreading through your empty stomach. The sensation brings tears to your eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of having something, anything, to fill the gnawing void within. The family eats in silence, each person focused entirely on extracting maximum satisfaction from their meager portion. The turnip pieces are chewed slowly and deliberately, allowing saliva to break down every fiber and release whatever nutrition might be available. The broth is sipped rather than swallowed, held in the mouth to appreciate its warmth before allowing it to slide down throats that have forgotten the sensation of being truly satisfied. As the meal concludes, the morning's next phase begins with the inevitable question of what to do with the remaining daylight hours. Venturing outside means exposure to cold that could prove fatal in your weakened state. But staying inside guarantees that no new food sources will be discovered. The forest beckons with the possibility of overlooked nuts, forgotten root vegetables, or bark from trees that others haven't yet stripped bare. Henry volunteers to make the journey alone, attempting to spare you the dangerous exposure, but his weakened condition makes this suggestion impractical. The task of foraging requires careful observation, patient searching, and the ability to distinguish between potentially edible plants and those that could prove poisonous. Your knowledge of local flora gained from years of gathering herbs and vegetables during prosperous times makes you the more logical choice for this dangerous but necessary expedition. The decision to venture out requires its own preparations. Each step is carefully considered to maximize your chances of survival and success. Your outer garments, such as they are, must be arranged to provide maximum protection while allowing freedom of movement. The rope that serves as a belt needs to be tied securely enough to prevent the loss of any items you might find, but not so tightly that it restricts circulation in your weakened body. Your bare feet touch the frozen earth floor, and the shock of cold travels up through your bones like lightning. The rags wrapped around your feet provide little protection, but they're all that stands between you and frostbite that could claim your toes within hours. Each step toward the door requires deliberate calculation, as sudden movements could trigger the fainting spells that have become increasingly common as your body struggles to maintain basic functions on virtually no fuel. The wooden door, warped from moisture and cold, resists your efforts to open it. The leather hinges have grown stiff and brittle, threatening to snap under pressure. When you finally manage to create a gap wide enough to peer through, the sight that greets you confirms your worst fears about the day ahead. Fresh snow has fallen during the night, covering whatever meager food sources might have existed beneath a blanket of white that makes foraging nearly impossible. The wind that rushes through the doorway carries with it the scent of death that has begun to permeate the village. Not the clean, quick death of accident or disease, but the slow, inexorable decay of a community starving by degrees. Somewhere in the distance, you can hear the sound of someone coughing, a wet, rattling sound that speaks of lungs weakened by malnutrition and cold. The noise echoes off the empty cottages where families once lived, creating a hollow reminder of how many neighbors have already succumbed to the famine's relentless advance. Your breath creates small clouds in the frigid air as you contemplate the journey ahead. The forest lies perhaps a quarter-mile beyond the village boundaries, a distance that once seemed negligible, but now looms like an impossible expedition across hostile territory. The path that leads there has become treacherous with ice. The energy required to navigate it safely could consume more calories than any food you might discover at your destination. Behind you, the children stir restlessly as cold air infiltrates the cottage's meager warmth. Pierre's whimpering grows more pronounced as his small body rebels against the dropping temperature, and Marie pulls her thin coverings more tightly around her shoulders. The fire you built earlier has already begun to die down. its brief life measured in minutes rather than hours. The choice between closing the door to preserve what little heat remains and leaving it open to facilitate your departure becomes another impossible calculation in the endless series of life or death decisions that define your existence. Henry's voice, barely audible above the wind, offers to accompany you, despite his obvious weakness. The suggestion carries both love and desperation, a husband's instinct to protect warring with the practical reality that he lacks the strength for such an undertaking. His legs shake visibly when he attempts to stand, and the effort leaves him breathless and pale. The sight of his deterioration forces you to confront the possibility that your family might not survive as a unit. Choices may soon need to be made about who has the best chance of living through the winter. The decision to venture out alone crystallizes as you observe your family's condition. Henry's strength must be preserved for tasks that require less physical exertion but equal importance, maintaining the fire and watching over the children during your absence. The risk of leaving them unattended pales in comparison to the certainty that without new food sources, today might be their last day of consciousness before the final slide into starvation's embrace. Your preparation for departure consists of gathering items that might prove useful during the foraging expedition. A small sack woven from scraps of cloth and barely larger than your fist could hold whatever treasures you might discover. The dull knife serves multiple purposes, from digging in frozen ground to cutting bark from trees to defending against the desperate animals that might compete with you for whatever edible materials remain in the forest. A length of rope, salvage from better times, could help you reach higher branches or secure yourself if weakness threatens to topple you into the snow. The psychological preparation proves even more challenging than the physical arrangements. Leaving your family means accepting the possibility that you might not return, that your weakened body could succumb to cold or exhaustion somewhere in the woods, leaving them to face their final hours alone. The alternative, remaining in the cottage while your food stores dwindle to nothing, offers only the certainty of collective death. The choice between probable failure and guaranteed doom drives you forward despite every instinct screaming for you to stay close to your loved ones. The first steps outside feel like walking into an Arctic wasteland designed specifically to test human endurance. The snow crunches beneath your wrapped feet with a sound that seems impossibly loud in the morning stillness. Each footfall sends sharp pains through your legs as muscles weakened by months of malnutrition struggle to support even your drastically reduced body weight. The wind cuts through your inadequate clothing with surgical precision, finding every gap in your defenses and exploiting them mercilessly. The village around you presents a tableau of abandonment and despair that would have been unimaginable just months ago. Cottages that once bustled with family life now stand empty. Their doors hang open to reveal interiors stripped of anything that could be burned or eaten. Gardens that produced abundant vegetables during the growing season have been dug up repeatedly by desperate hands, searching for overlooked roots or tubers, leaving behind only churned earth, frozen into hostile ridges and valleys. The well in the village center, once a gathering place where neighbors exchanged news and gossip, now serves as a stark reminder of how dramatically social interactions have changed. The wooden bucket that hangs from its rope appears to be the only thing in the village that hasn't been repurposed for survival. Even the stones that line the well's interior have been examined for any moss or lichen that might provide sustenance, leaving behind surfaces scoured clean by fingernails desperate enough to scrape nutrition from rock itself. Your progress through the village reveals other signs of the community's dissolution. The blacksmith's forge sits cold and empty. Its tools have long since been traded away for food that provided perhaps a week's sustenance. The mill that once processed grain for the entire region has become a hollow shell. Its great wheel is frozen in place, and its stones silent for the first time in living memory. Even the church, traditionally a sanctuary that remained inviolate during times of trouble, shows signs of desperate scavenging. Brass fittings and wooden decorations that once adorned the interior have mysteriously disappeared from their usual places. The few villagers who remain move through this devastated landscape like ghosts, their movements slow and deliberate as they conserve energy for only the most essential tasks. When your paths cross with Widow Bertrade, neither of you speaks. Communication is reduced to brief nods that acknowledge shared suffering without wasting precious breath on words. Her eyes, once bright with intelligence and humor, now hold only the hollow stare of someone who has seen too much death and expects to join it soon. The boundary between village and forest arrives sooner than expected, marked not by any formal barrier, but by the gradual transition from human devastation to natural dormancy. The trees ahead offer the promise of resources yet unexplored, though logic tells you that others have already combed these woods thoroughly in their own desperate searches for sustenance. Still, the possibility that something might have been overlooked, that fortune might grant you the miracle of discovering food where others found none, provides the motivation necessary to continue forward despite your body's protests. The forest floor beneath the snow tells its own story of desperate human activity. The ground has been disturbed repeatedly by people digging for roots, scraping away layers of earth in search of anything that might prove edible. Bark has been stripped from trees in irregular patches, creating wounds in the wood that weep sap frozen into amber tears. Even the smallest saplings show signs of having been examined and tested. Their tender shoots have been harvested by hands willing to try anything that might provide nutrition. Your search pattern follows a methodical approach developed through previous expeditions, starting with areas closest to the village boundary and working systematically deeper into the woods. Each potential food source requires careful evaluation, balancing the energy needed to extract it against the nutrition it might provide. A promising root system visible beneath the snow could contain tubers that might feed your family for a day. But digging them from the frozen ground could exhaust you to the point where the journey home becomes impossible. The silence of the winter forest creates an atmosphere both peaceful and ominous, broken only by the sound of your own labored breathing and the occasional crack of a tree branch surrendering to the weight of accumulated ice. The absence of bird songs or animal movements reinforces the reality that you're competing with creatures equally desperate for the scarce resources that remain. Even the forest's traditional inhabitants have largely abandoned this area, moving to regions where human scavenging hasn't yet stripped away every possible source of food. As you work your way deeper into the woods, following game trails that once led to abundant feeding areas, but now serve mainly as paths between barren stretches of land, the morning sun climbs higher, without providing any meaningful warmth. The light filtering through bare branches creates patterns on the snow that might have seemed beautiful in better times, but now serve only to illuminate the extent of nature's winter dormancy. Everything that could provide sustenance lies buried beneath layers of ice and snow or has already been consumed by the desperate humans and animals who came before you. Your hands, exposed to the cold despite attempts to keep them warm, begin to lose sensation as you search through snow-covered debris for anything that might prove edible. The process of clearing away snow requires constant movement to maintain circulation, but each motion demands energy that your depleted body struggles to provide. The cruel irony of needing strength to find food while lacking food to provide strength creates a vicious cycle that threatens to trap you in the forest. Too weak to continue searching, but too far from home to return safely empty-handed, the numbness spreading through your fingers forces a crucial decision. Continuing to search with bare hands could result in frostbite that would make any future foraging impossible. You press your hands against your body, trying to restore circulation while scanning the immediate area for anything that might justify the risk of prolonged exposure. A fallen log catches your attention. Its bark is partially stripped, but still retains sections that previous scavengers might have overlooked in their haste. Approaching the log requires careful navigation through snow that reaches nearly to your knees. Each step sinks deeper than anticipated and requires enormous effort to extract your wrapped feet. The wood itself bears the scars of desperate harvesting, with sections of bark torn away in jagged patches that reveal the pale wood beneath. Your dull knife scrapes against the remaining bark with a sound that echoes through the silent forest, alerting any nearby creatures to your presence and activities. The bark that comes away in your hands feels thick and promising, though you know from experience that much of its bulk consists of inedible fiber that will pass through your system without providing nutrition. Still, the inner layer might contain enough starch to justify the energy expenditure. The psychological benefit of having something to take home to your family outweighs the rational calculation of calories gained versus calories spent in obtaining them. As you work to harvest what bark remains accessible, movement in your peripheral vision causes you to freeze in position. A figure approaches through the trees, moving with the same careful deliberation that characterizes all human motion during these desperate times. Recognition comes slowly as the person draws closer, revealing itself to be Jack, the cooper's son, whose family cottage sits on the far edge of the village. His appearance shocks you even more than your own deterioration. His once robust frame now resembles a collection of bones held together by will alone. Jacques carries a small bundle wrapped in what appears to be the remnants of a grain sack, and his eyes hold the same mixture of hope and desperation that you recognize from your own reflection in still water. Neither of you speaks immediately, both understanding that conversation requires energy better preserved for survival. But his presence creates an unexpected complication in your foraging activities. The unspoken question hangs between you. Are you competitors for the same scarce resources, or might cooperation offer advantages that individual effort cannot provide? The decision to share information about potential food sources represents a gamble with your family's survival. But Jack's knowledge of the forest might complement your own in ways that could benefit both families. His father's work as a cooper required extensive knowledge of different wood types and their properties, information that might prove valuable in identifying trees whose inner bark or roots could provide sustenance. The risk of revealing your own discoveries must be weighed against the possibility of learning about resources you might have overlooked. Communication between you develops through gestures and brief whispered exchanges that conserve breath while conveying essential information. Jacques indicates a direction deeper into the forest, where he believes other scavengers might not have ventured, pointing toward a section where the undergrowth grows thicker and the walking becomes more difficult. Your own discoveries, the bark you've managed to gather and the location of the log that yielded it, become bargaining chips in a negotiation conducted entirely through necessity. The decision to venture deeper into the forest together creates an alliance born of desperation rather than trust. But even temporary cooperation offers advantages that neither of you could achieve alone. Jack's height allows him to reach branches that remain beyond your grasp, while your smaller size enables you to search through dense undergrowth that he cannot navigate without exhausting himself. The combination of your different capabilities might unlock resources that would remain inaccessible to either of you working independently. The path Jack leads you along winds through increasingly difficult terrain, where snowdrifts have accumulated to depths that sometimes reach your waist. Progress becomes a matter of breaking trail through obstacles that demand careful navigation and constant attention to avoid becoming trapped in hidden depressions or unstable footing. The energy expenditure required for this journey begins to exceed what your weakened body can sustain. But the possibility of finding untouched food sources drives you forward despite growing exhaustion. A cluster of oak trees ahead offers the promise of acorns that might have escaped detection by previous foragers. Their nuts are potentially buried beneath snow in quantities that could provide substantial nutrition if properly processed. The bitter tannins that make raw acorns inedible can be leached out through repeated boiling, transforming them into a starchy paste that could sustain your families for days. The investment of time and fuel required for this processing seems worthwhile if enough acorns can be located to justify the effort. Searching beneath the snow around the oak trees reveals signs that others have indeed preceded you in this quest. But their efforts appear to have been hasty and incomplete. Scattered shells and partially buried nuts suggest that previous scavengers worked quickly, possibly driven away by cold or competing demands on their time. Your more methodical approach, despite the energy it requires, begins to yield results as you uncover acorns that earlier searchers missed in their haste. Jack works systematically through the snow on the opposite side of the grove. His movements create a rhythm that coordinates with your own efforts to maximize the area covered while minimizing wasted motion. The pile of acorns growing in your small sack represents tangible hope. Each nut adds to the possibility that your families might survive another few days. The work itself provides temporary distraction from the constant awareness of hunger and cold, focusing your attention on the immediate task rather than the broader implications of your situation. The discovery of a partially collapsed animal burrow beneath one of the larger trees raises the possibility of finding cached food stores that squirrels or other creatures might have abandoned when they fled the area or succumbed to the harsh conditions. Excavating the burrow requires careful digging with your hands and the dull knife, working to enlarge the opening without causing the entire structure to cave in and potentially bury whatever treasures it might contain. Your efforts are rewarded with the discovery of a small cache of nuts and seeds that represent a significant addition to your growing collection of potential food. The mixture includes not only acorns but also hazelnuts and what appear to be maple seeds. Each type requires different processing techniques, but all offer nutrition that could extend your family's survival. The psychological impact of this success provides energy that seems to come from somewhere beyond your physical reserves, renewing your determination to continue the search despite mounting exhaustion. Jacques' excitement at your discovery manifests in increased efficiency as he expands his own search pattern to look for additional burrows or cache sites. His knowledge of animal behavior gained through years of hunting during more prosperous times guides his efforts toward locations where creatures typically store food for winter consumption. The partnership that began as a desperate alliance starts to feel more like genuine cooperation as shared success builds momentum for continued effort. The morning advances toward midday as you work through the grove, and the weak winter sun begins its early descent toward afternoon shadows that will bring even colder temperatures. The question of when to begin the journey home becomes increasingly urgent as your energy reserves approach dangerous depletion. The weight of the food you've gathered, while precious, also represents additional burden that your weakened body must carry across difficult terrain during the return trip. The decision to conclude your foraging expedition comes when Jack stumbles and falls while attempting to reach a promising cluster of branches. His legs simply give out beneath him without warning. The incident serves as a stark reminder of how close both of you are operating to the absolute limits of physical endurance. Helping him regain his footing requires effort that leaves you both shaking and breathless, highlighting the precarious nature of your situation and the danger of pushing too far beyond sustainable limits. The division of your combined discoveries requires careful negotiation that balances fairness against practical considerations of family size and immediate need. Jack's family includes 3 children compared to your 2, but your household also supports Henry, whose larger frame requires more nutrition to maintain basic functions. The mathematics of survival allow for no sentimentality, only cold calculation of who needs what to maximize the chances of collective survival. The agreement you reach gives Jack a slightly larger portion of the acorns and nuts, while you retain most of the bark and other materials that require processing techniques you're more familiar with. The seeds are divided equally, representing a compromise that acknowledges both families' needs while avoiding the conflict that could arise from perceived unfairness. Neither of you possesses enough to guarantee survival, but both have obtained resources that extend the possibility of living through another few days. The journey back through the forest tests the limits of your remaining strength as the accumulated weight of your discoveries combines with growing fatigue to make each step a deliberate act of will. The path that seemed manageable during your outward journey now appears fraught with obstacles that demand careful navigation and frequent rest stops. Jack's condition mirrors your own. His movements become increasingly unsteady, As exhaustion takes its toll on his already depleted reserves, the village boundary, when it finally appears through the trees, brings relief tempered by the knowledge that the most dangerous part of your journey still lies ahead. The walk back to your cottage requires crossing open ground, where wind exposure could trigger collapse or disorientation that might prove fatal within sight of safety. The irony of surviving the forest expedition only to succumb to cold during the final approach to home represents the kind of cruel twist that has characterized every aspect of life during the famine. Jack's path diverges from yours as you approach the village proper, leading toward his family's cottage on the opposite side of the settlement. Your parting consists of brief nods that acknowledge both the success of your cooperation and the uncertainty of whether either of you will survive long enough for future collaboration. The resources you've gathered represent hope, but both of you understand that hope itself consumes energy that weakened bodies can ill afford to waste. The sight of your own cottage ahead triggers an emotional response that threatens to overwhelm your carefully maintained composure. Smoke rising from the chimney indicates that Henry has managed to keep the fire alive during your absence, an achievement that required both skill and the sacrifice of precious fuel. The knowledge that warmth and your children await inside provides the motivation necessary to cover the final distance despite legs that shake with each step and lungs that burn with the effort of breathing cold air. The door opens before you reach it. Henry's face appears in the gap with an expression that combines relief at your return with desperate curiosity about what you might have found. Behind him, the children's faces peer around his legs. Their eyes immediately focus on the small sack you carry rather than on your own obviously deteriorated condition. The weight of their expectation settles on your shoulders along with the physical burden of the food you've gathered. Entering the cottage feels like stepping into a sanctuary, though the interior temperature barely exceeds that of the outdoors. The fire Henry has maintained consists of just a few glowing embers, surrounded by carefully positioned pieces of wood. Each one represents a calculated decision about when to add fuel and when to preserve it for later use. The warmth it provides seems luxurious after hours of exposure to winter wind, but you know that this comfort is temporary and purchased at the cost of resources you can't afford to squander. The process of revealing your discoveries becomes a ceremony of hope as you empty the sack's contents onto the cottage floor. Each acorn represents possibility. Every piece of bark is a potential meal that could sustain life for another few hours. The children's eyes widen at the sight of actual food, their expressions reflecting amazement that such treasures still existed somewhere in their increasingly barren world. Even Henry's face shows signs of the wonder that comes with unexpected good fortune during times of absolute desperation. The work of processing your discoveries begins immediately, as delay could mean the difference between extracting maximum nutrition and losing precious calories to spoilage or inefficient preparation. The acorns require careful shelling to avoid wasting any edible material, followed by grinding and repeated washing to remove the bitter compounds that make them inedible in their natural state. The bark must be cleaned and prepared for boiling, while the various seeds need sorting according to their individual processing requirements. Marie volunteers to help with the shelling process. Her small fingers prove more nimble than adult hands weakened by months of malnutrition. The task gives her something constructive to focus on, while providing a sense of contribution to the family's survival efforts. Pierre, too young for such detailed work, contents himself with watching the proceedings with the intense concentration that hunger brings to any activity involving food preparation. The afternoon passes in careful work as your small family transforms raw materials into substances that might sustain life for another few days. The process requires constant attention to detail and precise timing, as mistakes could render precious resources inedible or dangerous to consume. Every step in the preparation represents knowledge gained through desperate experimentation during previous weeks of the famine. Techniques that would have seemed unthinkable during times of abundance, but now constitute the difference between life and death. As evening approaches and the weak winter light begins to fade, the reality of your situation reasserts itself. Despite the temporary hope provided by the day's discoveries, the food you've gathered and processed might extend your family's survival for perhaps 3 or 4 more days if carefully rationed. But beyond that lies the same uncertainty that has haunted every day since the famine began. Tomorrow will bring the same impossible choices, the same desperate search for sustenance, the same calculation of whether the energy required to seek food exceeds the nutrition that might be found. The knowledge that Jack and his family face identical challenges provides little comfort, though it does reinforce the reality that your suffering is shared by an entire community, rather than being unique to your household. Somewhere across the village, other families are conducting their own careful rationing of whatever resources they've managed to obtain, each one hoping that their preparations will prove sufficient to carry them through another night and into whatever possibilities tomorrow might bring. Henry adds another small piece of wood to the fire as darkness settles over the village. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cottage walls that once seemed cheerful, but now serve mainly to highlight the emptiness of spaces where furniture and belongings used to create a sense of home. The warmth from this modest blaze will need to last through the night, providing comfort during the hours when cold becomes most dangerous to bodies operating on minimal nutrition and failing reserves of strength. The evening meal consists of a thin soup made from the day's gatherings, supplemented with careful portions of the processed acorns and bark. The taste bears little resemblance to food as it existed during prosperous times. But the sensation of having something warm in your stomach creates an illusion of satisfaction that your mind embraces despite your body's continued protests of hunger. Each spoonful represents a small victory against starvation, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing emptiness that has become your constant companion. As your family settles into their bedding for another night of fitful sleep punctuated by hunger pangs and cold, the sounds of the village around you tell their own story of collective endurance. Somewhere in the distance, a child cries briefly before being comforted into silence, while closer by, the sound of coughing echoes from a neighboring cottage where another family struggles with the respiratory problems that malnutrition brings. These nocturnal sounds create a symphony of suffering that serves as a constant reminder of how many people share your desperate circumstances. The darkness outside seems more complete than usual, as if winter itself has intensified its assault on the village and its inhabitants. Stars visible through cracks in the shutters appear cold and distant, offering no comfort or guidance for the challenges that tomorrow will inevitably bring. The night stretches ahead like an obstacle course that must be navigated carefully. Each hour presents its own threats to families whose reserves of strength have been pushed beyond all reasonable limits by months of systematic starvation. Your own thoughts turn to calculations that have become routine during these desperate weeks. Mental arithmetic that weighs the energy content of tomorrow's food against the calories required for basic survival functions. The mathematics of starvation allow for no optimism, only careful assessment of how long current resources might last and what additional sources might be found before they run out completely. Sleep, when it finally comes, offers only temporary escape from these relentless calculations and the constant awareness of hunger that has become the defining characteristic of existence during the Great Famine's merciless grip on your community. Your sleep comes in fragments, broken by the persistent ache in your empty stomach and the cold that seeps through every layer of covering you possess. Each time consciousness returns, the reality of your situation crashes over you like icy water, forcing you to confront another hour of existence balanced on the knife's edge between life and death. The straw beneath your body has compressed into a hard mat that provides no cushioning against the frozen ground, and every position becomes uncomfortable within minutes of settling into it. Henry's breathing beside you has developed a concerning rattle that speaks of lungs struggling to function without adequate nutrition to support their basic operations. His body generates so little heat that lying next to him feels almost like sharing your bedding with a corpse, though the occasional shiver that runs through his frame confirms that life still flickers within his skeletal form. The sound of his labored respiration mingles with similar noises from the children, creating a chorus of respiratory distress that highlights how seriously malnutrition has compromised your family's most basic physiological functions. Marie stirs restlessly throughout the night, her small body unable to find comfort on the inadequate bedding. When she shifts position, you can feel the sharp angles of her shoulder blades and hip bones through the thin fabric of her clothing. They remind you that her body has consumed its own muscle and fat reserves in the desperate attempt to maintain life. Her sleep is punctuated by soft, whimpering sounds that suggest dreams filled with food or memories of better times, though she never fully awakens to voice whatever thoughts might be troubling her unconscious mind. Pierre's sleep proves even more disturbed with frequent episodes of crying that force you to choose between comforting him and preserving the warmth generated by remaining still beneath your coverings. Each time you reach out to soothe him, the cold air attacks your exposed arm with vicious intensity, but the sound of his distress proves impossible to ignore. His small body feels fevered despite the frigid air, a concerning development that could indicate the beginning of illness that your family lacks any resources to treat. The fire dies to glowing embers sometime during the deepest part of night, and the temperature inside the cottage drops to levels that make continued sleep increasingly difficult. Your breath becomes visible in small puffs of vapor that dissipate quickly in the still air, while frost begins forming on the inside surfaces of the shutters, despite the minimal protection they provide against the winter's assault. The decision of whether to add more wood to revive the fire presents another impossible choice between immediate comfort and preserving fuel for tomorrow's critical needs. When morning light finally begins filtering through the cracks around your door, the gray illumination reveals a cottage transformed by overnight frost into something resembling a cave carved from ice. The water in your cooking pot has frozen solid, creating another obstacle that must be overcome before any food preparation can begin. Even the pile of processed acorns and bark from yesterday's foraging expedition shows signs of frost damage that could affect both their palatability and nutritional value. The morning routine begins with the same careful assessment that has started every day for months, checking each family member for signs of deterioration that might indicate approaching crisis. Henry's skin has taken on a waxy quality that suggests his body's systems are beginning to shut down in response to prolonged starvation, while his pulse feels weak and irregular beneath fingers too numb to provide accurate assessment. The children show their own concerning symptoms, with Marie's lips displaying a blue tinge that indicates poor circulation and Pierre's breathing becoming increasingly shallow and rapid. Your own condition has deteriorated noticeably since yesterday's expedition, with muscle weakness that makes even simple movements feel like tremendous effort. Standing requires multiple attempts as dizziness threatens to topple you back onto the straw. Walking across the small cottage demands careful attention to balance and coordination that once required no conscious thought. The energy expenditure of foraging has extracted a price that your depleted body struggles to pay, leaving you weaker than before. Despite the modest success in finding food, the process of preparing breakfast becomes an exercise in conservation and efficiency that would have been incomprehensible during times of abundance. Every movement must serve multiple purposes. Every action is calculated to achieve maximum results with minimum energy expenditure. Breaking the ice in your water pot requires careful strikes that avoid splattering precious liquid, while sorting through yesterday's gathered materials demands visual inspection that conserves the strength needed for more physically demanding tasks. The decision of how much fuel to use for cooking creates another agonizing calculation that balances immediate needs against future requirements. A larger fire would allow more thorough cooking of the acorns and bark, potentially improving their digestibility and nutritional extraction, but would consume wood that might be needed to prevent freezing during tonight's even colder temperatures. The compromise solution involves building the smallest possible fire that can still generate enough heat to warm food and melt ice, stretching each piece of wood to its absolute maximum utility. Pierre awakens with a cry that cuts through the morning silence like a blade. His small voice carries notes of pain and confusion that break your heart anew each time you hear them. When you gather him into your arms, his body feels simultaneously hot and cold, with patches of fevered skin alternating with areas that seem nearly frozen. His eyes, when they focus on your face, hold a glassy quality that suggests the beginning of delirium that often accompanies the final stages of starvation in young children. Marie's awakening follows more quietly, her movements deliberate and conserved, as if she understands instinctively that energy must not be wasted on unnecessary actions. When she speaks, her voice emerges as barely more than a whisper, asking not for food or warmth, but simply wondering whether the sun will shine today. The question carries layers of meaning beyond its simple words, reflecting a child's desperate hope that something in their world might change for the better, despite all evidence to the contrary. Henry attempts to contribute to the morning preparations despite his obviously declining condition. But his efforts prove more hindrance than help, as weakness causes him to drop items and lose his balance during simple tasks. The sight of your once capable husband struggling to perform basic functions that children could easily accomplish creates an emotional pain that rivals the physical discomfort of hunger. His determination to maintain some semblance of his role as family provider becomes both touching and heartbreaking, as reality makes such efforts increasingly futile. The morning's food preparation reveals how dramatically your family's prospects have changed since yesterday's successful foraging expedition. The processed acorns, when finally cooked into a thin paste, provide barely enough substance for each person to receive 2 small spoonfuls. The bark soup offers slightly more volume, but virtually no nutritional content, serving mainly to create the psychological comfort of having something warm in your stomach rather than providing actual sustenance for your failing bodies. The meal proceeds in complete silence as each family member focuses entirely on extracting maximum satisfaction from their meager portion. The acorn paste is held in the mouth until it completely dissolves, allowing saliva to break down every particle before swallowing, while the bark soup is sipped with careful attention to its warmth, rather than any flavor or nutritional benefit it might provide. These eating habits, developed through weeks of desperate conservation, have become ritualistic behaviors that provide psychological comfort even when physical satisfaction remains impossible. Outside your cottage, the village begins another day of collective struggle against starvation and cold. The absence of smoke from many chimneys tells the story of families who no longer possess fuel for fires, while the few thin wisps that do rise into the morning air indicate households that face the same impossible choices between warmth and conservation that define your own existence. The normal sounds of village life have been replaced by an ominous quiet, broken only by occasional coughing or the distant sound of someone chopping wood with movements too weak to create the sharp, clean strikes that characterize such work during healthier times. The church bell rings with its familiar bronze voice, though the sound now serves more as a daily miracle that the village still possesses enough life to mark time's passage than as a call to traditional worship. Father Guam's persistence in maintaining this routine provides one of the few constants in a world where everything else has been stripped away by the famine's relentless advance. Your critical decision involves determining whether anyone in your family possesses sufficient strength to venture out in search of additional food sources. Yesterday's expedition extracted such a severe toll on your physical reserves that attempting another foraging trip might prove fatal. Yet remaining in the cottage guarantees that your current meager supplies will run out within days. Henry's condition clearly eliminates him from consideration. While the children lack both the knowledge and physical capability to survive exposure to the winter conditions outside, the responsibility falls to you by default. Though honest assessment of your current state suggests that even a short journey might exceed your body's capacity to endure. Your legs shake when you attempt to stand, requiring support from the cottage wall to maintain balance, while your vision occasionally blurs in ways that indicate dangerous drops in blood sugar levels. The dizziness that accompanies any change in position has intensified since yesterday, suggesting that your body's ability to regulate basic functions continues to deteriorate with each passing day. The decision to attempt another expedition crystallizes as you observe Pierre's worsening condition and realize that desperate action offers the only alternative to watching your youngest child slip away during the coming night. His fevered state could indicate the onset of illness that might prove fatal within hours, or it might simply reflect his small body's final attempt to extract energy from tissues and organs that have already been depleted beyond sustainable levels. Either possibility demands that you find additional nutrition immediately, regardless of the personal cost such efforts might exact. Preparation for departure requires even more careful planning than yesterday's expedition, as your weakened condition makes every aspect of the journey more dangerous. The rags wrapped around your feet need additional reinforcement to prevent frostbite that could permanently disable you, while your outer garments must be arranged to provide maximum protection without restricting movement or circulation. The small knife and gathering sack represent the sum total of tools available for what might be your final attempt to find food for your dying family. The psychological preparation proves even more challenging than the physical arrangements, as leaving your cottage might mean never seeing your children alive again. Pierre's condition suggests that he could slip into unconsciousness during your absence, while Marie's strength appears to be failing at an accelerating rate that makes every hour precious. The possibility that you might return to find your family dead creates an emotional burden that threatens to paralyze your decision-making process entirely. Henry's farewell consists of a weak squeeze of your hand and words too soft to hear clearly. Though the love and desperation in his eyes communicate everything that needs to be said, his acceptance of your decision to leave reflects both trust in your judgment and recognition that no alternatives exist. Staying together to die offers no advantages over the slim possibility that foraging might yield enough food to extend life for a few more days. The weight of his faith in your abilities adds pressure to an already impossible situation. The morning air outside hits your face like a physical assault, cold so intense that your first breath causes immediate pain in your lungs and throat. The temperature has dropped even further during the night, creating conditions that make survival outdoors questionable for someone in your debilitated state. Each step away from the cottage requires deliberate effort, as your muscles struggle to respond to commands from a brain operating on virtually no fuel. While the wind cuts through your inadequate clothing with surgical precision that finds every vulnerable spot, the village around you presents an even more desolate appearance than yesterday, with additional cottages now standing empty and several doors hanging open to reveal interiors that have been completely stripped of anything useful. The well in the village center shows signs of recent activity, with footprints in the snow indicating that other survivors continue their own desperate searches for sustenance. Though the tracks appear fewer and more scattered than in previous days, the gradual reduction in signs of human activity tells its own story about how rapidly the village population is declining. Your progress toward the forest follows a different route than yesterday's expedition. partly to avoid areas already thoroughly searched, and partly because your weakened condition makes the direct path seem impossibly challenging. The longer route requires more energy expenditure, but offers the possibility of discovering resources that previous searchers might have overlooked. Though logic suggests that every square foot of accessible ground has been examined multiple times by increasingly desperate villagers, the boundary between village and forest arrives after what feels like hours of walking, but probably represents less than 30 minutes of actual travel time. Your perception of distance and duration has become distorted by the enormous effort required for each step, creating the illusion that simple journeys have become epic expeditions across hostile territory. The trees ahead offer both promise and threat, representing possible sources of food while simultaneously creating an environment where your weakened body could easily succumb to exposure or exhaustion. The forest floor shows even more evidence of human disturbance than yesterday, with snow churned and displaced by countless desperate hands searching for anything that might provide nutrition. Trees bear scars from bark harvesting that extends higher up their trunks than yesterday, indicating that people are taking increasingly dangerous risks to reach potential food sources. The systematic destruction of the forest's resources suggests that the area can no longer support even the reduced population that remains in the village. Your search pattern must be modified to account for your dramatically reduced physical capabilities, focusing on areas that require minimal digging or climbing, while still offering the possibility of overlooked resources. The methodical approach that proved successful yesterday now demands more energy than you can safely expend, forcing you to make rapid assessments of potential food sources rather than conducting thorough investigations. The discovery of animal tracks in the snow raises the possibility that wildlife might still exist in the deeper parts of the forest. Though your weak condition makes pursuing such mobile food sources completely impractical, the tracks themselves tell a story of creatures as desperate as the human inhabitants, with signs indicating that animals have been digging through snow in search of buried vegetation or cached food stores. Even the forest's traditional inhabitants appear to be struggling with the same resource scarcity that threatens human survival. A fallen branch partially buried in snow catches your attention. Its position suggests that it might have sheltered plant material from earlier harvesting efforts. Excavating around the branch requires careful digging that conserves energy while maximizing the area searched, a balance that demands constant attention to avoid overexertion. The work itself provides temporary distraction from the gnawing hunger and growing weakness, focusing your mind on immediate tasks rather than the broader implications of your family's deteriorating situation. Your efforts are rewarded with the discovery of several mushrooms growing beneath the fallen wood. Their pale caps and stems offer the promise of nutrition that could make the difference between life and death for your children. The species appears to be one you recognize as edible, though the poor light and your own failing vision make positive identification challenging. The risk of consuming poisonous mushrooms must be weighed against the certainty that your family will die without additional food sources, a calculation that leaves little room for caution. The mushrooms represent a significant find despite their small size, as fungi can provide proteins and nutrients that plant materials alone cannot supply. The careful harvesting process requires gentle handling to avoid damaging the delicate specimens, while ensuring that every edible portion is collected for transport back to your cottage. Each mushroom becomes precious cargo that must be protected during the dangerous journey home, representing hope that your family might survive another few days. The decision to continue searching despite your discovery reflects both greed for additional resources and recognition that the mushrooms alone cannot sustain 4 people for more than a single meal. The forest ahead still offers possibilities that might justify the continued expenditure of energy, though your body's protests are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The balance between pushing forward and preserving enough strength for the return journey creates another impossible calculation in the endless series of life or death decisions that define existence during the famine. A cluster of birch trees ahead offers the promise of bark that might be more palatable than the oak bark you harvested yesterday, as birch contains natural sugars that could provide both energy and improve flavor to the bitter soups that have become your family's primary sustenance. The trees show signs of previous harvesting, but their height might have protected upper sections from the reach of other desperate foragers, creating opportunities for someone willing to take risks to access higher bark. The attempt to reach higher sections of bark requires climbing abilities that your weakened body struggles to provide, with each upward movement demanding careful planning and precise execution to avoid falls that could prove fatal. Your hands, already numb from cold exposure, have difficulty maintaining grip on the smooth bark surface, while your legs shake with the effort of supporting body weight that seems impossibly heavy despite months of weight loss. The few strips of bark you manage to harvest come at enormous cost in energy expenditure that leaves you trembling and breathless. The growing pile of gathered resources in your small sack creates both satisfaction and concern, as the additional weight represents burden that your failing strength must carry across increasingly difficult terrain during the return journey. Each item collected adds to your family's chances of survival while simultaneously reducing your own ability to complete the expedition successfully. The mathematics of gathering versus carrying capacity becomes another cruel calculation that admits no perfect solutions. The sun reaches its highest point in the winter sky without providing any meaningful warmth, its pale light serving mainly to illuminate the extent of devastation that winter and human desperation have wrought upon the forest landscape. The shadows cast by bare branches create patterns on the snow that might have seemed beautiful during better times, but now serve only to mark the passage of precious time that could be spent searching for food or conserving energy for the journey home. Your body's signals of distress have become increasingly urgent, with muscle tremors and visual disturbances indicating that you are approaching the absolute limits of physical endurance. The decision to begin the return journey comes not from satisfaction with your discoveries, but from recognition that pushing further could result in collapse that would make your efforts meaningless. The small collection of mushrooms, bark, and other gathered materials represents hope, purchased at the cost of strength you could not afford to spend. The journey back through the forest tests every remaining reserve of energy and determination as accumulated fatigue combines with the weight of your discoveries to make each step a deliberate act of will. The path that seemed manageable during your outward journey now appears fraught with obstacles that demand careful navigation and frequent rest stops that you cannot afford to take. Your legs shake with each step, while your vision blurs intermittently, creating dangerous conditions for travel through terrain that requires constant attention to footing and direction. The village boundary, when it finally appears through the trees, brings relief tempered by the knowledge that the most dangerous part of your journey still lies ahead. The walk back to your cottage requires crossing open ground where wind exposure could trigger complete collapse within sight of safety and family. The irony of surviving the forest expedition only to succumb during the final approach home represents the kind of cruel twist that has characterized every aspect of life during the famine's merciless grip on your community. As you approach your home with the last reserves of strength nearly depleted, something extraordinary happens. Through the bitter wind, you hear voices carrying across the frozen village, voices that shouldn't exist in a place where most have already fallen silent. Jack appears at your cottage door, his skeletal frame trembling not just from cold, but from excitement that seems impossible given the circumstances. Behind him, Widow Ernest shuffles forward, her face bearing an expression you haven't seen in months. Hope. The words they speak feel like hallucinations born of starvation's cruel tricks on adult minds. A merchant's wagon has been spotted on the road leading to the village, moving slowly through snowdrifts, but definitely approaching. The impossibility of such news wars with desperate need to believe, creating cognitive dissonance that threatens to shatter what remains of your sanity. Merchants haven't traveled these roads since early autumn, when the first signs of crop failure made trade unprofitable and dangerous. Yet Jack insists he witnessed the wagon himself, pulled by two oxen that moved with the deliberate pace of beasts, carrying heavy loads rather than the frantic desperation of creatures fleeing starvation. The description includes details too specific to be fabricated by minds operating on the edge of delirium. Wooden wheels reinforced with iron bands, canvas coverings that suggest protection for valuable cargo, and most importantly, the steady progress that indicates purposeful journey rather than random wandering. Widow Ernest confirms the sighting from her own vantage point near the village well, adding observations about the merchant's apparent health and the presence of what appeared to be guards accompanying the wagon. The idea that healthy, well-fed people might voluntarily enter your plague-stricken community seems absurd. Yet the consistency of their reports creates trembling possibility that salvation might approach in forms too miraculous to contemplate rationally. Henry attempts to rise from his bedding with urgency that exceeds his physical capabilities, driven by hope that overrides practical limitations imposed by months of malnutrition. His efforts result in immediate collapse, but the determination in his eyes reflects emotions you haven't seen since the early weeks of crisis, when survival still seemed achievable through human effort. The sight of your husband responding to good news with anything approaching optimism provides emotional fuel that helps drive your own cautious acceptance of possibilities that logic rejects. The children's reactions to news of potential rescue reveal how completely the famine has transformed their understanding of normal life. Marie's questions focus not on what food the merchant might carry, but on whether such people still exist in the world beyond your dying village. Pierre's confusion about the concept of trade demonstrates how thoroughly their young minds have adapted to existence where nothing can be bought or sold because nothing exists to exchange. The decision to investigate these reports requires energy expenditure that could prove fatal if the information proves false. Yet, the alternative of remaining ignorant about potential salvation becomes unthinkable when hope presents itself for the first time in months. Your weakened condition makes even short journeys dangerous, but the possibility that relief might arrive demands verification regardless of personal risk involved in seeking confirmation. The village well serves as gathering point for the handful of survivors capable of movement, creating an impromptu council of skeletal figures who huddle together for warmth while debating the reality of reported sightings. Father Guam appears among the group, his gaunt frame draped in robes that hang like burial shrouds on his diminished body, but his eyes carry a spark of divine purpose that transcends physical deterioration. The priest's presence lends credibility to reports that might otherwise be dismissed as starvation-induced hallucinations, as his years of spiritual discipline provide foundation for distinguishing between genuine revelation and desperate fantasy. His careful questioning of witnesses reveals consistent details about timing, location, and appearance that suggest actual events rather than collective delusion, born of shared suffering and impossible hope. The merchant's wagon becomes visible in the distance as a dark speck moving against white landscape. Its progress confirms the reality of reports while raising new questions about motivation for such dangerous journey. The sight triggers emotional responses ranging from tears of gratitude to suspicious caution about strangers who would risk entering a community marked by obvious devastation and death. As the wagon draws closer, details become apparent that confirm the presence of goods and supplies that could mean the difference between continued survival and final surrender to winter's relentless assault. Canvas-covered loads suggest quantities of materials that exceed anything your community has possessed since the famine began. While the healthy appearance of both animals and humans indicates access to resources that seem almost supernatural given current circumstances. The merchant himself proves to be a middle-aged man whose robust appearance creates startling contrast to the skeletal survivors who gather to greet his arrival. His clothing shows quality and care that speaks of prosperity continuing to exist somewhere beyond your isolated experience of systematic starvation, while his confident manner suggests familiarity with trade negotiations that your community has forgotten how to conduct. His guards display the alert posture and well-maintained equipment that indicates professional competence and adequate nutrition, creating additional evidence that the broader world continues functioning despite the localized catastrophe that has consumed your village. Their presence raises questions about what dangers they expect to encounter while providing security for cargo valuable enough to justify armed protection. The wagon's arrival in the village square creates a moment suspended between past and future, between death and possible salvation. The resources visible on the wagon suggest that trade routes, disrupted since autumn, have begun to open again. Perhaps harvests in other regions escaped the disasters that devastated your lands. Perhaps communities possess surplus that they can exchange for whatever valuables remain in your village. The merchant displays sacks of grain, real grain, not the meager seeds you've gathered from forest floors. Dried legumes sit beside bundles of dried fruits. There are preserved vegetables and salted fish, items that seem almost unreal in their abundance, riches that belong to a world you've nearly forgotten existed. The negotiation for supplies happens methodically, with Father Guam representing the community's interests. Your family's portion seems almost generous, enough grain to create real meals, actual sustenance that will keep everyone alive for weeks if carefully rationed. The merchant also offers dried herbs that could provide flavor and nutritional variety. That first night after the merchant's departure, your cottage experiences something nearly miraculous. You prepare a true grain-based porridge, not the thin paste of boiled bark and grass, but real food with substance and nutrition. The children eat slowly, their bodies remembering what fullness feels like. Henry's strength seems marginally improved, his breathing less labored, as if adequate nutrition begins almost immediately to reverse at least some of the damage months of starvation has inflicted. Pierre's fever breaks completely for the first time in days. His eyes clear, his whimpering ceases, his small body settles into sleep that looks peaceful rather than fitful with suffering. Marie speaks more than she has in a week, her voice stronger, her cognitive clarity returning as her body receives what it desperately needed. The Great Famine of 1315 represents one of humanity's darkest chapters, a catastrophe that impacted millions across Europe with relentless, systematic cruelty. The weather patterns that created your family's suffering weren't localized accidents, but continental-scale disasters. Crops failed across vast regions. Livestock died from starvation and disease. Social structures that had functioned for centuries simply collapsed under the weight of universal desperation. In cities and countryside alike, people faced choices that modern consciousness finds almost unthinkable. Theft and murder over tiny amounts of food became commonplace. Social order broke down entirely in some regions. The famine demonstrated humanity's civilized veneer to be exactly that, a surface coating that vanishes when fundamental survival needs aren't met. Understanding why the merchant wagon appeared in your village requires understanding the broader economic collapse that accompanied the famine. Trade routes that connected regions became impassable in winter. Merchants faced serious risks traveling to communities experiencing mass starvation. The danger of robbery from desperate people created incentive for traders to avoid affected areas entirely. Yet some merchants continued traveling, understanding that communities would part with whatever valuables they possessed in exchange for basic sustenance. These traders represented lifelines for settlements that might otherwise have disappeared entirely. Their willingness to conduct commerce despite danger often provided the margin between collective survival and collective extinction. The weeks following the merchant's visit bring gradually improving conditions to your village. The grain supplies, carefully rationed, sustain the population through the remainder of winter. Nobody experiences abundance, but the constant immediate threat of death by starvation recedes slightly. Your family's health improves measurably. Henry recovers enough strength to begin small tasks around the cottage, repairing what he can with limited materials. Maria's energy returns enough that she can help with basic food preparation and household management. Pierre grows stronger daily, his childhood personality slowly returning as his body receives adequate nutrition for the first time in months. Other families in San Etienne experience varying levels of improvement based on their own resources and luck. Jack and his family endure. The cooperation you established while foraging proves valuable beyond the immediate food it provided. The experience created human connection that helps sustain morale through the worst months. When spring finally arrives, late by several weeks but with unmistakable arrival, the transformation feels almost miraculous. Snow melts from the fields. Remaining animals begin giving birth to calves and lambs. Survivors who made it through winter begin the work of rebuilding agricultural production, knowing that another failed harvest might come. Your family plants the largest garden any of you can manage with available resources. The physical act of working soil, of preparing for harvest, of participating in activities that have meaning beyond immediate survival begins the process of psychological recovery that the mere availability of food couldn't provide. Yet the famine never truly leaves those who lived through it. Body scars appear in ways that persist for years. Some survivors never fully regain full strength despite adequate nutrition. Children born to malnourished mothers show developmental differences that remain visible throughout their lives. The collective trauma of the community expresses itself in changed relationships, altered structures, and modified ways of understanding the world. People develop obsessions about food that make logical sense given their recent history. Families hoard stores more extensively than pre-famine customs suggested necessary. Discussion of meal planning becomes almost ritualistic, reflecting both practical necessity and psychological processing of trauma. Comprehending what Margaret's experience meant requires understanding medieval reality in ways modern consciousness often misses. This wasn't primitive survival. Medieval Europe possessed sophisticated agricultural systems, established trade networks, and complex social structures. Yet all of these broke down when weather patterns disrupted the fundamental basis of that civilization. The Great Famine of 1315 exposed fragility in systems that seemed permanent, revealing that civilization's continuity depended on relatively narrow parameters of climate and harvest stability. The psychological impact of this realization persisted throughout the medieval period. It contributed to anxiety about the future that manifested in various cultural productions in the decades following the famine. Your experience as Margaret represents the experience of millions. The specific details of your family, your cottage, your foraging expeditions belong to you. But the fundamental pattern repeated across Europe with horrifying consistency. The recovery from the Great Famine didn't happen quickly. It took years for population levels to stabilize. It took decades for communities to fully restore agricultural production. It took generations for cultural memory to process what had happened and determine its meaning. What's particularly significant about the famine's aftermath is how the experience influenced subsequent centuries. Agricultural innovation accelerated. Communities recognized that improving crop yields and storage techniques could prevent future disasters. Trade networks were deliberately expanded to create redundancy. If one region failed, others could provide sustenance. Food security became a fundamental concern of governance. Rulers who could ensure food availability were preferred to those who couldn't. Agricultural innovation received support and encouragement because improved yields meant reduced risk of famine. Trade became recognized as critical to survival because no single region could guarantee adequate production even in good years. The Great Famine never truly left European consciousness. Centuries later, during times of relative prosperity, people remained aware that famine could return, that survival wasn't automatic. This awareness shaped behavior in subtle ways: preferences for stored goods, anxiety about harvests, recognition that weather mattered profoundly to human fate. Even now, millennia later, the memory of the Great Famine persists in cultural archives, in historical records, in the consciousness of anyone who understands that our modern abundance represents a historical anomaly rather than a natural state. Most humans throughout history have faced genuine uncertainty about whether adequate food would be available. Margaret's experience, though desperate, represents normalcy for most of human history. Understanding her story means understanding something fundamental about human existence: the precariousness of survival, the power of determination and love to sustain people through impossible circumstances, the fragility of systems we assume to be permanent. As you complete the journey through Marguerite's world, her cottage in Saint-Étienne, her desperate foraging expeditions, her impossible choices, her eventual survival, consider what her experience might teach us. In a modern world where most people in developed nations have never experienced genuine hunger, where food security seems almost guaranteed, where survival appears assured, Margaret's reality feels almost incomprehensible. Yet her story is real. It happened to millions. The capacity to survive impossible circumstances, to maintain love for family when death seems inevitable, to persist in seeking solutions despite overwhelming odds, these qualities that Margaret demonstrates represent something eternal in human nature, something that transcends historical period or cultural context. The Great Famine of 1315 eventually ended. Spring came. Harvests improved, populations recovered. But the experience never truly disappeared from the consciousness of survivors or their descendants. Medieval memory, built on oral tradition and cultural transmission, carried the story forward. The year when the world seemed to be dying, when ordinary people were forced to become heroes simply by continuing to live. Margaret's life continued beyond the famine. She experienced the relief of adequate food. She watched her children grow. She lived to see recovery, to understand that the nightmare had ended. But she never forgot the months when survival seemed impossible, when each day required choices that no person should ever face, when love and determination were the only resources she possessed. This was your reality as Margaret, a medieval woman trapped in humanity's darkest hour. Every choice balanced on the razor's edge between life and death. Every breath demanded more strength than your body possessed. Every dawn brought impossible decisions that would haunt any soul fortunate enough to survive. The Great Famine of 1315 claimed millions across Europe, turning ordinary people into walking ghosts who fought against starvation with nothing but love for their families and stubborn refusal to surrender. The fact that you survived, that your children survived, that your community eventually recovered, these weren't guarantees, but miracles of human determination combined with luck and the merchant's arrival at precisely the moment when salvation seemed impossible. In our modern world of abundance, we can barely comprehend such systematic suffering. Yet these were real people who faced unimaginable hardship with courage that transcends time itself. Margaret's story represents the story of millions who lived through the worst that nature and circumstance could inflict. Understanding her experience means understanding what it truly means to be human, vulnerable, determined, capable of love even in circumstances designed to destroy hope itself.